Graduated from West Point in 1975. And then they sent me to MIT. I got my master's degree at MIT in 1980.
I guess we can get to your story.
Okay.
I don't know where to begin, so I guess you just start.
Okay.
Forever.
All right. Well, it was 2001. I had been assigned to the Pentagon from 96 to 98. But by 2000, I had been reassigned down here. So I was working here at Fort Gordon from 2000 until I retired in December of 2003. But the job I was in, this type of command I had, it was called a TRADOC system manager, and I was responsible for developing requirements for future Army radio systems, for developing new technology and getting those requirements approved at the Joint Staff level. The Vice Chairman and Joint Chiefs of Staff would have to be briefed to approve these requirements, because once they're approved, then they go out to industry to compete for contracts, and they bid and say how much they would have to spend to build those requirements, and then the Army awards contracts, multi-billion-dollar contracts to develop this type of stuff. So while I was in charge of developing those requirements, I was constantly going back and forth to the Pentagon. I lived here in Georgia. I lived in Evans, and I was working at Fort Gordon. I was in the Pentagon as much as I was at Fort Gordon for those first couple of years of that assignment, 2000 and 2001. And it's kind of funny, because September of 2001, I had not been in the Pentagon for about 3 months. Because I just got finished briefing the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, something called the JROC, the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, to get some requirements approved in the spring of 2001. And for the year prior to that, I was in the Pentagon every week. I'd go up there and spend 2 or 3 days attending meetings and guiding discussions and briefing generals to get things approved. But all that culminated in April or May of 2001, and we got this major document approved, and then I didn't have to go to the Pentagon for a while, for a couple months, because we finished that cycle and was working on other things where I still traveled some, but now I was traveling to Fort Irwin, California, where we were practicing or working with some of the equipment out in a combat training environment, getting feedback from the users about what was working right, what wasn't working right. So I wasn't going back to the Pentagon very much, and September 11th was the first day I had been back in the Pentagon since like April, which in that type of job I was in, that was quite a long stretch with me not having to go to the Pentagon. Right. So this was September 11th, 2001 was a Tuesday, and I had just found out about this meeting that I was going to be required to go to over the weekend, Saturday or Sunday, September 8th or 9th. So normally, my secretary would get me a room in a hotel that was right across the south parking lot from the Pentagon, and I wouldn't get a car. She'd fly me into the National Airport. I would take the free shuttle from Washington National over to this hotel, which was like 100 yards away from the doors of the Pentagon, a couple hundred yards, 100 yards from the parking lot, so a couple hundred yards to the security and the entrances into the Pentagon. And I wouldn't get a car. I would just stay in that hotel and walk back and forth to the Pentagon when I had meetings and things, and then take the free shuttle from the hotel back to the airport when I would come back to Georgia. But because this meeting was decided on or planned so late, by the time she checked to try to make arrangements for my travel, that hotel was full, and she couldn't get me into a hotel. There were actually 3 hotels in Arlington that were pretty close to the Pentagon. You could walk to the Pentagon from, and they were all filled, so she had to put me in a hotel in downtown DC, which is really inconvenient because the DC traffic is really bad. It's like Atlanta traffic or San Francisco traffic or anywhere where you're a big city. So you don't want to have to drive, but she had to set me up in a hotel for Monday night in DC, which meant she had to get me a rent-a-car. Well, that ended up being a blessing, the next day, because normally I wouldn't have had a car when I was doing work at the Pentagon. So I stayed in this hotel in downtown DC on Monday night, and then I had this meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock Tuesday morning, September 11th. And then because I was going to be at the Pentagon anyway, I had arranged to do a briefing to a 3-star general, General Lovelace, later that afternoon. So I was going to be in this meeting about Army data radio requirements at 9 o'clock in the morning, and then I forget what time, but sometime in the afternoon, 1 or 2 o'clock, I was going to brief this 3-star general, and then I'd be flying back to Georgia Tuesday night. So I get up Tuesday morning, and because I didn't know what the traffic's going to be like, and I wasn't used to driving in D.C. because I would usually stay right outside the Pentagon, but I got up early enough to get into the Pentagon plenty early, just in case there was bad rush hour traffic. And, but you know, I got into the south parking area probably about 8:15 or 8:20, maybe 8:10. You know, I had left myself kind of an extra half hour in case traffic was bad, and traffic wasn't bad, so I got into the Pentagon parking lot by 8:15. And thinking, wow, this is good. I got here plenty of time. Meeting's not till 9. So I'm walking into the Pentagon from the parking lot, thinking I'll have a chance to get some breakfast or something at one of the cafeterias there before I go into my meeting. But the first thing, so now we'll get into the September 11th story. That's kind of background just to explain why I had a car that day, because that comes into play later in trying to get home that night. But so I'm walking towards the Pentagon. And you may, I've talked about this a little bit, I don't remember if you've ever heard me, but either in class or sometimes at chapel, I talked about 9/11. But my first impression walking towards the Pentagon was how beautiful a day it was. I mean, it was such a, you know, September 11th, so it's fall, you're up in the Northeast, so it's a little cooler than it is here, and that was my first impression. When I had left Georgia the day before, on Monday, September 10th, it was still hot down here. This year we had kind of a mild September, but that year, I mean, September 10th, it was a really hot day down here at Fort Gordon. And I get out of this rental car and start walking the Pentagon on September 11th. It was like a crisp, cool fall morning. It was just beautiful. It was so noticeable. The sky was a beautiful blue. It was so noticeable and so overwhelming that I actually stopped on my way into the building and prayed just for a second. I had stopped and just closed my eyes and said, and I thanked God for such a beautiful day, because it was that much different than the hot weather I just left here the day before. So that was my first impression, was how beautiful a day it was. And the sky was so clear and so blue. And if you remember where you were on September 11th, or you watched pictures since then of New York, it was the same way in New York. I mean, just a beautiful day, a clear, bright day. But anyway, so that was my first impressions, walking in the building. What a beautiful day it was. I went into a place to grab something for breakfast. I forget what I had, but and then go into this meeting, and I'm one of the first ones there. I get there about 8:45, and it's so busy in the Pentagon. I could tell you from when I was there between 1996 and 1998. How you didn't have a free minute, much less any gap of time. I mean, you're always going from one thing to another. I mean, I would be in meetings, and I'd be leaving one meeting and walking towards the next meeting, and a guy would be briefing me on what our organization's position was, and here's your talking points, and here's what you need to be saying at this next meeting. And it's just like non-stop. You're just constantly busy. So when I went into this conference room at 8:45, I think, if I remember right, I was the only one there. I was the first one there. And this is a 9 o'clock meeting, so I'm not real early, but it's like 8:45, and I'm the first one in the room. And then gradually people start coming in over the next 15 minutes. And then the last people that walk in, a couple minutes before 9, had just seen on TVs in their offices, seen a plane hit the first World Trade Center tower. So the last couple people coming into the meeting said that, have you all seen what just happened in New York? And nobody had. I mean, the first plane hit like at 8:46 or 8:48 or something like that. So the people who were in the room had not seen that or been aware of that. And I can remember asking somebody, well, you know, what was it, an accident? And nobody knew yet. Only 10 minutes had gone by. Nobody knew what had happened yet. And you know, everybody's kind of interested, like, whoa, what happened there? Most of us would have felt like we'd have liked to have left the room at that point and gone to find some office that had a TV and watch the news and see what was happening in New York. But at that moment, we felt like the issues we were about to talk about were very, very important, and well, we can't delay. We can't just go check and see what's happening there. We need to get in this meeting. So, you know, at 9 o'clock we start our meeting, and we're talking about the Army's data radio requirements and which units are going to need which capabilities, and we've got representatives from the different services, Army, Navy, and Air Force, and representatives from different units and types of units to explain some of the requirements. And we're actually doing a video teleconference. We've got 10 or 15 of us in that room, in that conference room, and we're connected by video teleconference to people from other places. There were some people from Fort Monroe. There's actually some people from Fort Gordon in the video teleconference, and we're just beginning to exchange information. The meeting's probably going to go an hour and a half or 2 hours. But, you know, about a half hour into the meeting, I think it was 9:36 or 9:38, you know, we heard this loud explosion and the room shook. And I thought, what was that? So we had some what we call backseaters. The principals, the people who are mainly responsible for the positions from their organizations are sitting at the main table, and then people who are supporting them or have information to back them up or answer questions for them are sitting in the back row. And we turned around and sent a couple of the back row guys out to go see what that was, because what it felt like and sounded like was like a bomb had gone off, and that was my first impression. You know, somebody must have just set off a bomb.
Had you in your mind maybe connected the two?
No, and in fact at that point, no connection. I mean, I didn't even remember that 40 minutes earlier someone had said, you know, a plane had hit one of the World Trade Centers, and we didn't know that the second tower had already been hit, and we didn't know that. So we had heard, you know, a few minutes before 9, the plane had crashed into the World Trade Center, and I didn't make any connection. I don't think anybody made any connection to that at that moment, but we did think somebody had set off a bomb. And the room we're in didn't have any windows, and the door was closed, so we could feel it. It shook the room, but we didn't know if it was somewhere in the Pentagon. My assumption was it was somewhere out in the parking lot, some demonstrator or something. Somebody had set off a bomb maybe in one of the parking lots, because you can't get into the Pentagon. It would be difficult for a terrorist to get into the Pentagon and set off a bomb because of all the levels of security they'd have to get through. So that was my thing. It was probably a bomb went off somewhere. I mean, it was clearly an explosion. I mean, it was loud enough, and you know, just the fact that the room shook, you knew, wow, that was something. Wonder what that was.
Did stuff fall off the wall or?
No, it wasn't that violent. I mean, you know, there were some things on the walls, but I mean, it shook the room, but it was short. It didn't last as long as like an earthquake might last, 6-7 seconds. It was just a very loud explosion. The room shook for an instant, maybe, you know, a second or two. But anyway, so it was violent enough that we sent somebody out. We thought, again, what we were doing was very important, so we kept going with our discussion, but we sent some people out to see if they could find out what that was, and, you know, is it okay to keep going with our meeting? Well, before they even could get back, we had security guys opening the door yelling, "You got to get out of the building." So we start picking up our stuff, and they said, "No, you got to get out of the building now." So everybody starts moving out of the building, and the conference room I was on is on the first floor. So we're going out the first corridor. There's 10 corridors that connect the outer areas, the parking areas, into the Pentagon, and then in through the rings of the Pentagon. So we're walking out first corridor, and between each ring, from the A to the B ring, from the B to the C ring, it opens up to the sky, and you can see up. You know, it's kind of like 5 buildings that are all parallel to each other in those rings.
I looked at some pictures of the crash site.
Yeah. So we're walking out first corridor, and as we go past the first ring and look up, and you see this big billow of black smoke just kind of pouring in on us. And then, you know, everybody had probably been pretty calm up to that point. We started running at that point, thinking, okay, so this bomb was in the building, building on fire. We need to get out. So we get out all the way out to the south parking area and turn back and look back and see this hole in the wall and smoke and fire and flames. But we still, those of us who were in that meeting that didn't have any windows and didn't have any TVs and didn't realize what had been going on for 40 minutes, had no realization that this was a plane that just had hit the building. Well, I still thought it was a bomb because there was nothing left of that plane. There was no parts of the plane or anything you could see to make you realize that was a plane that just crashed. It looked like a bomb had gone off. Part of the building was starting to collapse. The building was on fire. People were pulling people out. And so those of us who got out into the south parking area, a lot of us moved up under the 495 underpass or the overpass, but we got up under it just because now we're thinking what's going on, and just kind of get under some shelter in case something else is going on. And then, you know, as you get out of the building, you start talking to people who weren't in meetings, who were watching things that were going on TV, and we started realizing, okay, this must have been a plane. This is a part of a big operation going on, because the second World Trade Center tower had been hit, you know, 15 or 20 minutes before the Pentagon got hit. So there were people who were out there in the parking area evacuating from the Pentagon who already knew both towers had been hit. The second one was very clear. People were watching the news of what had happened when this plane hit the first tower on TV. They saw live shots of a plane crashing into the second tower, and if anybody was in doubt after the first one, by that moment everybody knew this is intentional. Don't know who's doing this, why, but this is intentional. And then, of course, the plane hit the Pentagon, and then a half hour later, the flight that they think was coming back for the Capitol building, you know, Todd Beamer and that crew were able to wrestle control away from the terrorists, and that one crashed into a field in Shanksville. But that hadn't happened yet. Right. But we talked to enough people to realize this was a plane, and we're under some kind of attack, and you know. But before that realization, as we're going out of the building, I'm looking back at the Pentagon burning. My thought, it's kind of like, it's surreal. And in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so what time? I'm thinking of the things we're doing right now that were so important. And I'm thinking, well, you know, I wonder when they're going to let us back in the building. Is my briefing to General Lovelace going to be delayed? And it's like, it's not real. It's not, you don't make the connection. And after a few minutes of thinking and talking with our people and realizing what's going on, you realize we're not going back in that building today. They're not going to let us back in. And you had the people who were right next to the impact area doing everything they could to get bodies out and give first aid to people who were still alive. And, you know, there's nothing we're going to be doing in there today. But at that moment, I didn't realize that. So that was my first impressions of that day. Fortunately, as I was running out of the building, I grabbed my cell phone and called my wife and got right through immediately and let her know I was okay, because I thought she's going to see this on the news, and she knows I'm in the Pentagon this morning, and so I want to make sure she knew I was okay. And had I not contacted her immediately, I would have not gotten through to her for hours probably, because after calling her, like 10 minutes later, as I'm looking at it, when this realization came in, oh, you know, I'm not going back in that building today. All right, now what do? I'm supposed to return the rent-a-car to Washington National and fly back today, but I went back to my rental car, and I was listening to turn on the car radio and listening to these reports of everything. By the time I'm on the car, they're talking about how the buildings in New York are starting to collapse. The first one was starting to collapse and fall down. So I tried to call my office, my assistant in Fort Gordon, to say, now what can you see if I can just take the car back to Georgia instead of returning to National, because they're already saying that they were shutting down all the airports. You know, this is by about 10 o'clock probably. A little over an hour after the first plane hit. By that time, they'd already announced that they're shutting down airports, and I'm thinking, okay, so I'm not going to be able to fly back out of National today. I'm not going to be able to stay here. I'm not going to be able. This meeting's not going to finish. I'm not going to be briefing General Lovelace today. So what do? I guess I go home, and so I called to see if they would make arrangements for me just to drive the car home, and they said, well, you can't return it to National anyway. National Airport's closed, so you're not going to be able to return it there. And my deputy was named Doug Wilson. He said, I think you just need to drive it home and turn it in at Augusta, and you know, get forgiveness, because you're not going to find a way to give you permission at this point. You're not going to find somebody to give you permission to change the contract or drive the car. And that's the thing I was worried about at that moment. I'm just, you know, I'm alive, and I'm thinking, now how am I going to get home? So all right, so the decision's made. I'm going to drive. But anyway, about the phone calls, I couldn't. When I first started trying to call Fort Gordon, I could not get. I mean, the cell networks are immediately tied up with emergency responders, and you know, there was so many phone calls going on, people trying to reach loved ones, and The networks were completely saturated, and you couldn't get a phone call out. But eventually, 20 or 30 minutes later, I got through to my office at Fort Gordon and told them, okay, well, I'm going to be driving back however long it takes. It was a 9-10 hour drive. I won't be back till tonight. I'll just see you at work tomorrow, Wednesday. Well, by the time all that happened and I realized that I wasn't going back in the building and decided, all right, I'm going to get in this rent-a-car. We've been up under this overpass. I'm going to go down to the rent-a-car and listen to the radio and figure out what's going on. And after all that time going by, I wasn't a lot of time, but this is probably, I lost 30 or 40 minutes waiting to figure out what's going on, what should I do. I'm not going to do any more work here today. I need to go ahead and leave. By the time I made that decision to leave and got in the rent-a-car and turned it on and started trying to drive out of Arlington, it was a parking lot. You couldn't move. Had I immediately, when I left the building, gotten into the car and tried to drive out, I probably could have got out. Mm-hmm. But by the time 40 minutes went by and I decided to try to drive out, all the roads were closed down so they could get emergency vehicles in. All the routes out of Arlington were shut down so that ambulances and fire and police could all get in. And I sat in gridlock for I don't know how many hours, but this happened 9:36. So this is about 10 o'clock, 10:10 in the morning. I started trying to drive, and it was well after 1 in the afternoon before I got out of the parking lot at the Pentagon. So I mean, it was 3-4 hours, and then I got into Arlington, and they still got the roads closed, and it's just nobody's moving. But eventually, I was able to get out of Arlington after about 4 hours. And once I got out of Arlington and got across the Beltway and onto an interstate, then you could drive. Then you could, the traffic flowed. But I sat in traffic probably for 4 hours, just trying to wait for the opportunity to move up an inch at a time, a foot at a time, until enough traffic was able to clear out. But everybody was in that situation for those few hours. So I got into Georgia, if I remember, it was about 2 in the morning, 1 or 2 in the morning, and I turned on the TV because I hadn't seen any of this. Mm-hmm. So I turned on the TV, and then I was up for a couple hours watching this, just in amazement, because I hadn't seen any of these pictures. I hadn't seen the planes crashing into the building, and at that point, nobody had any pictures of the plane hitting the Pentagon. They later, a few days later, found some security cameras that showed the last segment of that flight hitting the Pentagon. But so I was up till probably 3 or 4 in the morning that night. Finally got to bed and went into work at Fort Gordon sometime, a little bit before lunch, probably on Wednesday. But yeah, it was some kind of experience. Everybody who worked in the Pentagon knew somebody that was impacted by that. But the ground zero in the Pentagon, where the plane hit the Pentagon, is a room, you'll see it come up every once in a while on my screensaver there. It's a room that I was in where I was promoted to colonel in 1997, where Connie and my 2 youngest stepsons, and you see General Gunther there pinning these on. That was General Gunther's office in 1997, where I was promoted to colonel. And part of the reason so few people died, right after I left the Pentagon in 1998, they started on a renovation project, a major 10 to 12 year project where they're going to rent. The Pentagon was built right after World War II, and most of the materials and most of the office spaces in there were original materials from 1946 and 1947, and it was in dire need of renovation. And they finally got it approved in the budget to renovate the Pentagon in the late 90s. And they started in 98 or 99 on a 10 or 12 year process to renovate the entire Pentagon, but they're going to do it 1/5 of the building at a time. They call them wedges. And next, this wedge was going to go into renovation. Well, this was the first wedge. The plane hit right along the 4th corridor, and that was in the area of that first part of the renovation, and it had just finished, and they were just starting to reoccupy those offices. So many of the offices that were blown away in this impact of this plane were still unoccupied. But the office where I was promoted, the G6 of the Army staff had moved during that renovation over to this wing here where I was sitting in that meeting. And when they reopened this, instead of moving them back, for whatever reason, I wasn't there, so I don't know what the discussions were or how that happened, they decided to move the G1 back into this office space. All right, so what was the G6's office, who's a 3-star Army general, was on September 11th, the G1's office now, who's also a 3-star Army general, and he was killed instantly. And in fact, to this day, you know, 11 years later, he's still the most senior officer to die in the war on terrorism. But he died at the initial impact immediately. That plane crashed right through his office and took out the next 3 rings of the Pentagon and all the offices on either side of that corridor. But Lieutenant General Kern, Paul Kern, was the G1. But that was now his office at that point. Had the G6 people, had they shifted back to their original office space, that's where that's where I was in the meeting. We would have been right in that impact area. So I mean, I see it as just you know, some people call those things coincidences, but the grace of God in my mind that I wasn't right in the impact area, because that was our offices, the G6 offices, prior to the renovation. But of course, many people still were there, and most of them were killed that were right in that area where the plane hit. But I can remember in the first few months, first year, the 1-year anniversary, there were lots of opportunities because I happened to be in the Pentagon, very close in fact. I mean, from where the plane penetrated and destroyed all that, there's only 80 yards to 100 yards from where we were sitting in that conference room, and that's why we could feel it and hear it so clearly. We were very close to the impact area, but that's one of the things I see by the grace of God. People would ask, well, you know, where was God in all this? Why did these kinds of things happen? And I was given lots of opportunities to talk about this because I was in the Pentagon when the plane hit. When I came back, in fact, I got back that Wednesday, and I was already scheduled to give a talk at a graduation, one of the officer training classes, graduations on Friday, and I was able to talk about it then. And then I was invited to speak in lots of different places just to see what my perspective was as a person who was in the building when it happened. And that's a question that a lot of people ask, and that's one of the things I talked about a lot, was where was God in all these things, and how it's tragic to see nearly 3,000 people die in a 1-hour period in New York, in Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. with this terrorist attack. It could have been so much worse, and you see these miraculous stories of escape. You see the fact that where this plane hit, there's no spot anywhere else in the Pentagon it could have hit and caused fewer casualties. You know, if it had hit somewhere else, it may have been hundreds or 1,000 or more than 1,000, a couple thousand people could have been killed. But where it hit, because most of that part of that building was vacant, of course terrorists didn't know that.
Right.
I guess they could have if they had a little better intelligence, but you know, by intelligence I meant, like, you know, the military aspect of intelligence, data collection, collecting information about your enemy. But anyway, where it hit, again, we only had about 60 or 70 people who in the Pentagon who were killed. Everybody on the flight was killed, and then another 60 or 70 who were in the Pentagon. Had it hit anywhere else, there would have been at least 10 times that many casualties. So you see those kinds of things, and even guys that were right in that impact area that escaped. You know, one guy who was a Christian who was he worked in that office that I was describing, and yeah, this is a little memento that we put together, but it says 9:38. I was trying to remember what time he felt it hit the building. So it was at 9:38 it hit the building. Well, about 9:35, he had left that office to go use the men's room down this corridor, and he was just coming out of the men's room when the plane actually hit. Had he been back in his office, he would have been killed. As it was, he still ended up having 50% of his body burned. They didn't think he was going to survive. He's the guy, if you're pretty young, how old are you now, 20? So you're about 9?
Yeah.
You were 9 when that happened. So you may not remember this, but you know, a few days after the attack on the Pentagon, President Bush was visiting survivors in the hospital at Walter Reed and Bethesda Naval Hospital, and there's this one classic moment where he comes in and he salutes this soldier lying in a bed, all wrapped, all burnt up, and the soldier tried to raise his arm to return the salute to him. But anyway, he was very close to that and survived.
Did you know him?
I didn't know him at the time. I've come to know him since then because we brought him down to talk at Fort Gordon I've talked about him in a lot of the speeches I've given and remarks and interviews I've given because of his Christian testimony, how he knows that the reason God spared him is because God wasn't finished with him and he had more to do through him. But the way that he was able to inspire a lot of other people, survivors as well as family members of those who didn't make it through his testimony and his faith. But that's what gets you through, and that's what, you know, when I went into that meeting at 5 minutes till I went into it at 8:45, but you know, as we went into that meeting at 9 o'clock that day, what I thought was important at the time was the Army's data radar requirements. And moments later, when that plane hit the building and we're evacuating the building, you realize how unimportant those things are. And that's what comes to your mind is what is really important in life, and what's important is your faith and your family. And that's what I experienced as I'm walking out. The first thing I do is call my wife, because that's what mattered, is that I'm still alive. I still have these relationships with other humans, and those are what matter, not what are we going to do in our job today, or what are we going to do for the Army next year. I mean, it's your faith and your family. And I've told people this in remarks that, you know, family, because humans, we're the only part of God's creation that's eternal. You know, all this, everything else is going to pass. This world is going to pass away, and there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. But we live forever. Our souls are eternal, and we're the only part of God's creation that He designed in His image, and that He created to be eternal. And that's why that's all that matters. And when something like this happens, that realization hits you that that's, you know, people up with Hurricane Sandy. This is probably Connie. If this is Connie, you can let her in. She just wanted to get in the door. Yeah, she's here. You want to just open that door for her. So, you know, you realize that that's what's important. But the guys up in New Jersey and New York, you know, last month with that hurricane, so many of them lost their homes. But you see the gratitude they have if they didn't lose loved ones, if their family's still intact. That's always the first word out. Yeah, we lost everything, but you know, we're still together. We're all still alive, and the gratitude they have, that they realize those other things are temporary. They can't be, or even if they can't be replaced, you know, old photos or whatever. That, you know, maybe you got some things that can't be replaced, but they're not significant. They're not valuable compared to our lives and our relationship with each other, because those will last forever. And then your faith is important because it helps you to have the perspective to understand things like this. How can this happen? Why does this happen? To have the perspective and the context with which to be able to cope with these types of things that happen. So, you know, that's a lot of it.
So what's your favorite part about your job now?
Now? Oh, I love, well, you know, the part I love about my job now is similar to what I loved about being in the Army, and that's teaching, coaching, mentoring young people. That was a big part, is not so much when I was a lieutenant, although when I was a lieutenant I was in charge of 30 guys, but most of them were actually older than me, and been in the Army and had a lot more experience than I did as a brand new second lieutenant. But as I got into more senior ranks in the Army, the thing I always enjoyed the most was making an impact and influencing young people. As a battalion commander, the opportunities I had to shape these 18 and 19-year-olds and what their view and perception was of what it meant to be a soldier and what it meant to be in the Army, and to have an influence and impact on that. That's the same thing that I like about teaching, and that's why I feel like God led me into teaching and coaching, because I could continue to do that in just a different setting, but kids that almost same, maybe a little bit younger, you know, freshmen and sophomores in high school are 4 years younger than the typical soldier who's just coming into the Army. But to have that opportunity to impact their lives and be a role model for them, and be an example for them of what it means to be a Christ follower, and to serve God, and how to do that, and how to be a person of integrity, and how to make right decisions and right choices, and have a big impact on that part of their lives, both as a teacher and as a coach. You know, I don't know if you know, but I just gave up the coaching. I won't be coaching next year, and this is probably my last year of teaching. It's not definite yet, but I've been handing things off to try to transition towards not working anymore, just to spend more time with kids and grandkids. So this might be my last year, but I feel like God called me into this, so He's going to make it real clear that He's releasing me from that call next spring before I make that a final decision that I'm going to stop doing that. But I've enjoyed doing it for these 9 years because of the impact you can have as a person who's teaching young people. So.
All right. Well, I think that's it for now.
Okay, it's good timing because
Yeah.
I'm supposed to be in the gym in 10 minutes.